Communication Arts and Sciences at the Pennsylvania State University from 1984 to 1998. He has been president of both Central States Communication Association and the National Communication Association. He has served as the editor of Communication Studies and Communication Monographs Journal and has published in excess of 180 books, chapters, refereed articles, and more. Dr. Gouran has received a multitude of awards, including the Penn State College of Liberal Arts Outstanding Advisor Award in 2001, the NCAA Distinguished Scholar Award in 1992, the Speech Communication Association of Pennsylvania Robert T. Oliver Lifetime Achievement Award in 2002, and this year is being inducted into the Central States Communication Association Hall of Fame. And beyond all these wonderful things I've just mentioned, I worked really closely with Dr. Gouran at Penn State University when I was there as a student. I could say he's also an amazing person. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dennis Gouran.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I am indebted, and as the probably most technologically challenged person in this room, I'm also indebted to Craig Scott at Rutgers University, who in one of his articles indicated that anything that is independent of a message producer that facilitates the exchange of messages qualifies as technology. Here is my technology. Groups, as I'm sure all of you are aware, are very enigmatic because on the one hand they are capable of extraordinary achievement, and on the other hand often capable of terribly serious flaws in the way in which they approach problematic situations, even to the point of carrying us to the brink of extinction in the extreme. If you were here this morning for Dr. Mitra's presentation and his interest in sustainability, this is one area in which clearly there are issues in need of address that are not always being effectively addressed. Now, I wish I could say that my interest in group decision-making and problem-solving as a facet of organizational life stemmed from that kind of metaphysical and empirical question. Why do we have this contradiction in the competency of groups? But to be perfectly honest, that's not how I got interested in this area of study. I got interested in it at the University of Iowa when I was a graduate student and enrolled in a course called Group Communication. And having had an undergraduate course called Discussion, I was curious in my graduate course why none of the material that we looked at had anything to do with communication, with a few rare exceptions, and also why it was that people whose work we were reading were not in the field of communication. So it was that interest that led me to start thinking about what might be some worthwhile questions for someone in a communication program to pursue for study and beyond the conferral of a degree, if I were going to be fortunate enough to earn a degree. And I came up with an interest in consensus as the objective, according to some people, of group interaction, which seems to me to be a worthwhile kind of pursuit, that we probably are advantaged by functioning in a society in which we can attain consensus on social issues of importance, not on trivial issues, but consequential issues where the costs of being wrong can run high. And as a result of that, I carved out a dissertation project in which tried to distinguish what it was, communicatively speaking, that separated groups that were able to achieve consensus through their interaction in addressing problematic situations from those that fell short. And that sort of launched my sustained interest in this as an area of study. The more philosophical and metaphysical issues with which I started this presentation began to surface as I sustained my interest in this area and encountered more questions than I was coming up with answers. In any event, during the early 1980s, I sort of teamed up with a person with whom I've written a great deal of co-authored scholarship by the name of Randy Hirakawa. He is now Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. And as our interests continued to converge, we began trying to address a criticism of small group research as produced by people in the field of communication, which was the absence of theory. There were a lot of people asking questions about communication in groups, but they weren't codifying anything within a theoretical structure that would suggest new areas of research and the advancement of our understanding of communicative processes, particularly within the realm of problem solving and decision-making discussions. So we were guided by work that had gone on not by researchers in communication, but by practitioners and people who were teaching courses like the one I alluded to when I was an undergraduate called Discussion and Group Methods, which fostered an approach to participation in problem solving and decision-making groups that was based on John Dewey's method of reflective thinking. But unfortunately, what people who were drawing on that were doing was using the method of reflective thinking as an outline for formal presentations that people would give in classes that followed the steps, but not the requirements that are associated with making sound judgments about the answers to the questions that form this so-called standard agenda / method of reflective thinking. So that was kind of our starting point, and our early work was rather primitive. We posited a set of propositions in which we were taking the position that to the extent that the interaction among the members of a problem-solving or decision-making group assures that adequate attention has been given to the components of the method of reflective thinking, the outcomes are more likely to be positive outcomes insofar as solving problems and making good decisions is concerned than poor ones. And that was a sort of impoverished view back in the early 1980s when we started this line of work. But over time, the sustained interest in the question of what it is, communicatively speaking, that effective decision-making, problem-solving groups are doing that is different from what those that would qualify as ineffective are doing, kept us going. And there have been a number of different advancements, I think, in the perspective that we began with in this rather primitive form. In addition to John Dewey's initial influence, we Also, we're indebted to the work of a sociologist by the name of Robert F. Bales, whom some of you, I'm sure, in your communication classes have encountered. One of the few people in social psychology and sociology who were interested in communicative acts. You might have encountered his scheme for codification of communicative acts called interaction process analysis, which is a 12-category scheme into which you can put every bit of verbal and nonverbal interaction, which is kind of convenient to be able to reduce the totality of characteristics of communicative acts to 12 categories. It becomes manageable. And more importantly to the advancement of our theory, primitive though it was what Bales devised this category system to do in the first place. He was interested in something called equilibrium theory. And in his study of small groups, he was trying to find out what it is that people are doing when they interact with one another in problem-solving groups, which were largely, in the context in which he was working, policy-making groups. What they were doing to bring into balance what he referred to as, or equilibrium, bring into balance the management of the relational needs of group members with the task-related needs. Bales was of the view that groups function ineffectively under circumstances in which those two sets of needs are out of balance. And you can think of this as kind of a pendulum-like swing that goes on in groups. At some points, we are overly attentive to the social emotional needs of the members of a group, and at other points, we are overly attentive to the task needs. But within time, what will happen is that those two sets of needs come into reasonable balance. If they don't, then you've got groups that are in trouble. If all we do is manage our social relational needs, there's going to be a cost in terms of how effectively we are in meeting the requirements of tasks. And conversely, if we spend all of our attention being task-focused and ignore relational needs of the members of a group, we're going to be in trouble. You might succeed in the short run, but in the long run, you're going to have a dysfunctional group. We were also guided in our interest by work that started in 1972 by someone whose name you probably know pretty well, Irving Janis, who wrote a book called Victims of Groupthink. Janis's term, the coining of that term, groupthink, is one of the few social science constructs that has entered the public discourse. I hear on television people on talk shows saying, well, I think this group is suffering from groupthink. You don't hear many people take social science concepts and apply them to everyday life in the way that groupthink has been in evidence. I think a lot of people who use that term don't understand what Janis was talking about, but nonetheless, they are familiar that there's something called groupthink that is problematic when groups fall victim to it. In fact, that's why he called the first edition of his book Victims of Groupthink, where he was looking at foreign policy decisions by people who presumably were intellectually well equipped to make the best possible decisions and who failed in the process. And he was asking the question, how could this happen? In the same sense that you can look at an achievement that occurred this week in the area of astrophysics. And you know what achievement I'm talking about? A team of astrophysicists reported being able to have traced gravitational waves from the first 1/1,000,000,000 of a second pursuant to the Big Bang. That's a remarkable achievement. That what happened in that 1/1,000,000,000th second, as I understand it, changed the nature of the universe from being quantum-based to gravity-based. That would mean a whole lot more to people who know more about astrophysics than I do, but I can appreciate the magnitude of the achievement. And yet, we are part of a species that, in terms of the kind of thing that Dr. Mitra was talking about earlier today, can make some monumental miscalculations and judgments. And in the realm of decision-making, they can be very costly kinds of mistakes indeed. In any event, those are the three external sources. It might be noteworthy that none of the three people that we've talked about were communication scholars. John Dewey is, in the mind of some people, America's greatest philosopher, historically speaking at least. Robert Bales was a sociologist and social psychologist, and Irving Janis was a clinical psychologist initially and social psychologist later in his career. But these were sources of inspiration. And we were indebted to the thinking of those three individuals in helping advance our own thinking when it came to what we might be able to do that ultimately we hoped would have practical value to account for decision-making effectiveness. Well, the theory has been under evolution since 1980 up to the present. I wish it were evolving more rapidly in the present than it did initially, but some of the alterations in the theory from what I characterized earlier as its primitive form have been, over the years, the addition of a set of assumptions that underlie the method of inquiry that our structure represents and is guided primarily by the views of John Dewey in terms of what are the requirements that are necessary in order to engage successfully in complex forms of problem solving. That was a continuing concern of Dewey. What is it that people who incur success in trying to solve problems of an intellectual nature that are not obvious in the solution potential are doing that's different from other people? So we felt that it was necessary to enhance that view by looking at what kinds of assumptions you have to make about what people are doing when they are engaged in successful problem-solving and decision-making activity. The theory evolved further with the development, I think, of a more clearly propositional structure. We were guilty in the initial formulation of casting this as a series of steps that you go through, consistent with what I viewed as the pedagogical approach to this course called group discussion. And I think that we came to an appreciation of the fact that it's not a series of steps, it's a pattern of thinking that we're talking about, and some habits of mind that people need to cultivate if indeed they're going to make significant progress in solving problems of a complex nature as opposed to those of a trivial nature. A third aspect of the evolution of this perspective was the expansion of the number of factors that may be operative in any given situation. Initially, we were just concerned with these so-called habits of mind, but Irving Janis once again sort of came to the rescue and indicated you can attempt to go through this sequence of activity as developed by John Dewey. And Irving Janis, as a matter of fact, has a system of thinking that is very much reminiscent of what John Dewey was talking about. But that's not enough. Our view initially was, well, to the extent that communication functions or serves to assure adequate attention to each of these, what we began to call requirements of decision-making and problem-solving tasks, the more likely it is that groups are going to make good choices rather than poor choices. But Janis enlightened us in his work by calling to not only our attention, but readers of something that he concentrated on very heavily in a book called Strategic Decisions, called the Constraints Model. And what Janis was trying to suggest from his studies of decision-making in groups is that members of those groups fall under certain kinds of constraints that lessen the likelihood or probability that the requirements of the task are going to be satisfied. The first category of constraints that he talked about fell under the heading of cognitive constraints. And this has to do with the tendencies that everyone in this room, again, I think, is subject to and you can identify with in your own decision-making behavior. Have you ever been in a situation where you were asked to perform a group project and the immediate response of the members was, we don't have time to do that? None of you have had a boss who wants things done yesterday. I'm sure you've had a mean teacher, someone who's giving you, from your point of view, too little time to coordinate activity in a way that would yield a successful product. Well, we overreact often when that kind of constraint takes hold and people become anxiety-ridden under those circumstances. If the members of our group say, we don't have time to complete this project in any way that is going to result in the outcome we would like, the teacher is being unreasonable, or the boss is being unreasonable. Or we have the time, but we don't have the resources necessary to complete the project or solve the problem. Then you're given to expediency under those circumstances. And people want to take shortcuts that fall under the label of heuristics. One heuristic that Janis talked about was the standard operating procedure. What have we done in the past under circumstances in which we've been confronted with a task, even if it's only remotely consistent with what we're occurring? Well, let's do that. Or they engage in a pattern that the Nobel Prize-winning Herbert Simons, for his work in decision-making, came up with, and that's the concept of satisficing. Most of us do that because we can't fully satisfy the requirements of rational models of choice, which assume unlimited amounts of time and unlimited resources and unlimited skill, and none of us have that particular combination. What Simon said is that even in situations where we're dealing with consequential problems, what most people do is hit on a few options that seem on first blush to have the potential to address the issue with which a group is concerned. And they make decisions on that basis. The term satisficing that he coined came about because people are saying, this is good enough. And probably you've all experienced that. How many of you had to search for a place to live this year? Yeah, a lot of you. How many places did you look at?
Physically?
Yeah.
None.
None? So
I did it mostly
you're a
online.
homeless person out there?
No, I have a place, but I looked online. I would say about 5 to 7.
5 to 7, okay. I saw some other hands. Put those hands back up, I don't know. Yeah, how many did you look at?
About 15.
15? That's quite a lot. How about over here? Did anyone look at 3? So I'm running out of time. School's about ready to start, so I'll take this. It meets my requirements. Not ideally, but it meets my requirements. So you satisfied under those circumstances. There's nothing wrong with that. We make a lot of decisions that way, probably. Most of the decisions. So resorting to that heuristic does not necessarily entail making a bad decision, but if the cost of being wrong can run high, that heuristic is unwise. So there are these shortcuts that come into play in the decision-making, problem-solving process in groups when they fall under the influence of cognitive constraints. In short, when they feel pressured to act as quickly as possible in order to get rid of the anxiety that they are experiencing. The second category of constraint that Janice talked about that we added to our particular version of the decision-making theory was affiliative constraints. And this is the one of the 3 that Janice identified that comes closest to what he was talking about when he coined the term groupthink. Under circumstances in which people are under the influence of affiliative constraints, the feeling is such that they place the importance of relationships within the group above the importance of making the best choice of which they are capable. She is telling me that my idea for how to solve a problem is very good when privately she believes that that idea stinks. But she doesn't want to hurt my feelings by telling me that that's a very bad idea because that might impair our relationship. So you fall into the trap of going along to get along and minimize relational problems that might come from resisting the pressures that our needs for affiliation often create when we are trying to engage in some kind of collective problem-solving or decision-making task. And the third category that Janice identified was what he referred to as egocentric constraints. And this has to do with the dominance tendencies that some members of groups display. In fact, when I was teaching a course like the one I described having taken myself, one of the most consistent complaints that I received from undergraduate students is that so-and-so is dominating the discussion. What do I do about it? Did you confront so-and-so? No. Well, why not? Well, because I could be punished. And I wouldn't like the response that I know so-and-so is going to make if I indeed challenge. So, solve my problem for me. Well, how can I solve your problem? I'm not a member of the group. But we fear the negative sanctions that people, particularly when there are differentials in power, pose for us, and resist engaging in behavior of a communicative nature that would, again, increase the likelihood that adequate attention to the requirements of the task will be paid to those requirements. So if you don't take into consideration these 3 categories of constraints, then you're asking for trouble. So we enlarge the theory to indicate communication when it is functioning to help individuals overcome the problems posed by these three categories of constraints, then the group is likely to do better than if it lets those constraints take hold. Because it's like other kinds of things where you get too far down the pathway, you can't retreat. But if you can stop things from taking a toll early on, then progress is more easily possible under those circumstances. Well, the next alteration in our thinking over this period of time that I've been talking about was the expansion of the categories of decision-making and problem-solving issues. We tried to come up with a propositional structure that enabled one theory to account for what was going on in decision-making and problem-solving that dealt with different kinds of issues. How many of you have been exposed to the concept of the question of fact? None of you have had that? Of course, you have. Okay, one. Conjecture? None of you have been you have. Okay. Value? Value? One person for each of these four categories there. And policy. Most decision-making models sort of presuppose that what you're talking about is policy, but that's not the only kind of issue on which people are making decisions. You just heard a very fine presentation prior to this one in which Dr. Scheer was talking about the jury system, in part, in that presentation, and people involved in that are frequently dealing with the question of fact. Did the person accused of a crime commit that crime? Well, you don't know for sure whether or not the answer yes is accurate, but a jury, we would hope, especially if you're innocent and on trial, would take very seriously that question. Question of conjecture places issues in the future. People in corporate life are continually confronted with that. What if we bring out a new model of a product in January? Is that going to be a problem, or would it work to our advantage? I would be interested, for example, in how in the Apple Corporation decisions about how frequently to bring out new models of iPads and iPhones are made and what considerations go into it. Because at the time you make the decision to do this, say, in June, you don't know what the consequences of that decision are going to be, but questions of conjecture concern not matters of truth, but matters of probability. What is likely or unlikely to occur as a result of certain sets of actions. Value. Questions of value relate to issues concerning what is acceptable and typically in a moral sense. And finally, questions of policy, which have to do with what actions should be taken in response to a condition that gives rise to a felt need for some kind of action. Well, you could come up with a theory for each of those four kinds of questions, but what we tried to do as we worked with the theory was formulate a set of propositions that cover all four types. And I'll get to those in a moment. And then the final step in the evolution of the theory was the refinement of the conception of the principal-dependent variable. Effectiveness is what a lot of people interested in the study of decision-making, problem-solving talk about. But that is an elusive kind of concept. What do we mean by effectiveness? Well, for each of those four kinds of questions that we were talking about just a minute ago, the outcome could be different. What's the measure of effectiveness of the answer to a question of fact as opposed to what is an effective or an index of effectiveness when you're talking about the outcome to a question of conjecture or value or policy. What we settled on finally was the concept of appropriateness. And appropriateness as an outcome that would apply to the answer to all four of those kinds of questions has to do with the choice that you're obliged to make if you have carefully analyzed the information pertinent to the question. There is going to be one answer that more clearly stands out than others, and that's the appropriate choice. Now that may not seem like a great amount of change over a 30-year period, but as theories go, and particularly in the social sciences, that's a rather substantial evolution that I've just walked you through in 15 minutes here. That's 30 years out of Hirakawa in my life to get to that point. Well, with that, I can give you a fairly condensed representation of the theory as it presently stands. There is a more extensive version of this that I won't try to take the time to work through fully, but the theory for purposes of this presentation is something that rests on several critical assumptions. The first of which is that the members of a group are motivated to make an appropriate decision. You don't need a theory to account for why groups fail in decision-making and problem-solving tasks if the members are not motivated to make appropriate choices. Anyone can say, this is an idiotic task that we've been given, and I have no interest in performing it. I don't need a theory to account for that kind of behavior. So it's important that the assumption that people want to do the right thing, make appropriate choices, is warranted. If it's unwarranted, then forget about it. You can easily explain poor performance. These people made a bad decision because they weren't motivated to make a good decision. And if they happened to make a good one, it was by chance, not by design. The interesting question is, what if people are highly motivated to do well in the performing a problem-solving or decision-making task and fail to do so? Then you need some way to account for that failure. The second major assumption, I think, underlying the theory is that the members of a group have an adequate understanding of task requirements, and that it's a well-developed understanding. How many of you have been in a group where it's supposed to be a problem-solving task, and the first thing out of somebody's mouth is, well, I think what we ought to do is... You not did? Yes. I think if you thought about it, all of us have been around people who, when they are charged with doing something as a collectivity, there is this one person who always has the decision in mind or the solution to a problem in mind and wants to start that. And that kind of individual can be very resistant to observations such as, don't you think we ought to find out, first of all, what problem we're trying to solve? Now, everybody knows what problem we're trying to solve, so let's just get that off the table and move on to this wonderful idea that I had. And I'm always surprised, even in the work I do in the University Faculty Senate, with how little understanding committees have with the responsibilities that go along with the formation of policy in particular. a lot of legislative activity within the Senate, and I'm sure in other legislative bodies, stems from an axe to grind that a particular individual has who may not even reveal what that axe is, but will propose that certain legislative changes be made, and then argue why they should be made after the fact. What is it that prompts consideration of a change in policy in the first place? The third assumption is that the members of a group have the necessary resources, and or that at least they are available. If you don't have the right information, it doesn't matter how well motivated you are or how good an understanding you have of task requirements. If you don't have the resources to work with, you're, again, likely to make a good choice or solve a problem effectively only as a result of happenstance, not as a result of the activity in which you've engaged. And then finally, the assumption that we added to a list of a greater number of assumptions is that the group be possessed of requisite task-relevant skills, and that those skills be in the collective membership of the group. This society has a bad habit every time it faces a problematic situation of doing what? What is a move of first resort that a lot of people take? Yes?
Getting all the experts together.
Well, no, I wish if they were going to do that, that would be better, but let's turn that over to a committee. Let's point a group again. Well, that's nice, and in a spirit of democracy, it's nice to utilize collective effort. But if people don't have the requisite skills to perform a task, this team that I just referred to that had the monumental achievement in astrophysics, they could have added me to the group. That would have been absolutely pointless and, in fact, a liability because it would slow down the group, not knowing anything about the subject matter. So that's a very important assumption. If you have a bunch of people who don't have the skills necessary to perform tasks and satisfy the requirements of those tasks adequately, then it's a waste of everyone's effort. So that's a fairly important assumption now. Now, on to the main propositions, of which there are three that I'm going to share with you. The theory evolved to the point, as I said, that it has a clearer propositional structure than it did in its original formulation. And the first proposition goes something like this. Appropriate choice is more likely when the members of decision-making and problem-solving groups do five things. 1, show a correct understanding of the issue, that is fact, conjecture, value, or policy. 2, determine the minimal characteristics of any acceptable choice option. 3, identify a relevant and realistic set of alternatives. 4, examine carefully each option in relationship to each characteristic. And 5, select the option that best conforms to the minimal characteristic. Now, in framing those requirements, task requirements in that way, it was easy to subsume all 4 of the kinds of questions that we were talking about within one category there. So that those 5 requirements apply equally well to questions of fact, conjecture, value, and policy. And we thought that was a pretty important advance. Otherwise, we were going to have a theory where you said, if you're talking about this kind of question, you need to specify the requirements this way. And if you're talking about some other kind of question, you need to specify the requirements in another way. A theory that gets that complicated is loses its utility. And so we were rather pleased that we were able to get past that previously problematic situation. The second of the three main propositions is that appropriate choice is more likely when the members of decision-making, problem-solving groups enact interventions suitable for overcoming or minimizing the three kinds of constraints that I talked about earlier. Since I already went over those, I won't go over them again. And then thirdly, and this is a proposition where we've gotten a lot of flack, particularly from students, that appropriate choice is more likely when members of decision-making and problem-solving groups, one, review the process by which they have arrived at a choice, and two, reconsider the option that they have tentatively endorsed if that requires even beginning again. And it's that last one that bothers a lot of people. If you try to apply that in an actual situation by saying, well, now that we've reviewed the process by which we arrived at this conclusion, maybe we didn't do such a good job. What? Are you out of your mind? I just spent 3 hours out of my life that I'm never going to recover. So, no, I'm not interested in that. And even when I've tried to talk with students about that in not the context of an actual discussion, but just as a general principle, that it's a good idea to reflect back over how you arrived at a decision, because we're not always conscious of what we're doing at the time we are doing it. And to be willing to admit to the possibility that you made a bad judgment when all is said and done and may have to start over. This does not set well with people. That's, in their minds, a bad idea. If you invest a certain amount of time, when that time is exhausted, that's the end of the process. Well, we all know of situations that came back to bite people or proved to be unfortunate 2, 3, 4 months, even a couple of years down the line, where an ounce of prevention might have overcome the need for the so-called pound of cure that they discover has been necessitated by mismanagement in the initial stages of the decision-making process. The current status of our theory is as follows. We regard it as part normative, meaning that it has a prescriptive dimension to it. I think both Professor Hirakawa and I would say, we are telling people that you would be well advised to behave in ways as specified by those propositions. And that you would also be well advised to assure before you turn a group loose on a problematic situation or a decision that has to be made, that the assumptions have been satisfied. So we're quite willing to admit that our theory as it presently stands is part normative. But it's also part descriptive in the sense that, say, if you do these things, then even if you don't like doing them, the likelihood of making better decisions and coming up with more effective solutions to problems increases. A lot of social scientists want no truck with anything that's prescriptive in nature, let alone practical. When I was at Indiana University, I encountered the head of the psychology department there. He asked me what I did, and I went over some of these same kinds of things. He said, well, that sounds very practical. I said, well, I hope so. And his response was, well, my department, if it's practical, we have no interest in it. Felt about that big, you know. After having been put down by a psychologist telling me what real social science is about, and he felt that it was not. about what either Professor Hirakawa or I were about, but in any event, we think that it is justifiable to tell people if you have bases for recommending certain approaches to problem-solving and decision-making situations to do so, provided that there's evidence in support of those actions. In that vein, there is a limitation with the theory as it presently stands. It's supported by what both of us regard as an insufficient amount of empirical information. The most significant body of information that's available at this point has to do with efforts to assess the merits of different alternatives. People seem to do that reasonably well, and if they do, they make better decisions, and those that don't make worse decisions. But we don't have as much evidence to suggest that determining the nature of the issue to be resolved makes that much of a difference in the outcome, or that the selection of standard by which you're going to judge the acceptability of different solutions. So there is work to be done. Someone was asking earlier this morning, do you have any ideas about what would make a good master's thesis? Well, that would be one, doing more work on those aspects of this theory that have not received a lot of attention in research. The theory also lacks, in my judgment, sufficient consideration of criteria or the determination of those characteristics of choice options that make them acceptable or unacceptable to the decision makers. And particularly when it comes to what I'll be getting at in the last part of this presentation, the ethical aspects of leadership as it would relate to effective decision-making and problem-solving discussion. And I think finally, although I'm more convinced of this than Professor Hirakawa, is that the theory is in need of more refined assessments of how well communicative acts serve the designated functions that we've been talking about. Professor Hirakawa is more inclined to say you get at that issue by frequency counts. You're doing a better job, for example, of satisfying the requirement of how well a decision satisfies the set of criteria that have been selected by frequency of mention. For criterion 1, in successful groups or groups that make appropriate decisions, the frequency with which this occurs is X. In unsuccessful groups, the frequency with which this kind of attention occurs is X minus some number. So numerical superiority wins. We haven't found evidence to suggest. And there are lots of inconsistencies. There are groups that fail, for example, to pay much attention to the extent to which a decision option satisfies a set of criteria whose outcomes are better than groups who have paid more attention to that. And to illustrate the point I'm trying to get at, which is probably a little abstract, let's say that in response to requirement number 1, which is demonstrating an understanding of the issue. Go back to my example where someone says, everyone knows what the issue is. Well, you paid attention to that. But that's doing a lousy job. Make that assertion. Well, yeah, but you paid attention to the requirement, so you get a 1. And somebody else says, yeah, well, let's not mess around with that. So you get too now. People paying attention to the requirement of trying to assess adequately an understanding of what issue is to be resolved, but they're doing a terrible job. My prediction would be that a group that approaches the task in that manner is going to do far less well in making an appropriate choice than a group that has fewer tallies indicating an effort to define the problem or the issue. So there's a qualitative element that I think has to be addressed when people are looking at how groups that make appropriate choices are distinguished from groups that make inappropriate choices. And frequency counts are not going to be enough to make that determination. In fact, they can even be misleading, as I hope my examples show. Well, the title of this presentation was Rational Approaches to Collective Decision Making, the Role of Ethical Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness. And to this point, I haven't really talked about organizational effectiveness or ethical leadership, but I think they are important. Professor Hirakawa and I think, are deserving of criticism for neglect of the role of leadership, and particularly ethical aspects of leadership in formulating this theory. We felt originally that introducing concept of counteractive influence was sufficient attention to that need, which gives a view of leadership as largely reactive. A group is not doing well, and under those circumstances, a need arises within the rest of, or within the membership, for at least one person to make that acknowledgement. That we referred to as counteractive influence. If the group is doing everything well and satisfying these requirements, you don't need any leadership. I think that was our view. I believe both of us are starting to rethink that notion of leadership as counteractive influence in decision-making, problem-solving groups. And for a variety of reasons, but I won't work through all of those. One of them is that it's more easily possible than you might think for a kind of slippage in ethical sensitivity to take hold in a group, where the members are not trying to do anything reprehensible or do anything wrong. They just lose sight of the fact that there may be some kinds of neglect when it comes to the moral aspects of their behavior that needs more conscious attention and would reside in the role of the leader of a group. We have not worked out this issue all that well, but I think there are some promising leads in the work of several people who are interested in the ethical aspects of decision-making in groups. How many of you in one of your classes have encountered the term transformational leadership? You all have. Yeah, what's a transformational leader?
Transformational leadership, leadership theory, innovative, I guess, in the sense that you're going to change how the group thinks about their task, how the group looks to interact with that task and with each other, and change the paradigm to complete the task.
Yeah. You know, I think it's pretty good. James McGregor Burns is a political scientist, again, where are the communications? Who formulated the notion of transformational leadership And his view was that a transformational leadership, a leader, unlike what he referred to as a transactional leader, who influences through the exchange of rewards and punishments and threats and promises with other members of a group or organization, is concerned with the moral well-being of subordinates and acts in ways that contribute to people with whom the person exercising leadership is interacting to place the collective good above the individual good, and thereby to become transformed in a moral sense. You become a better person by virtue of interacting with a transformational leader, and the transformational leader becomes a better person by virtue of having served that function. And I don't think that we've gotten anywhere close in our work to that kind of exercise of leadership, but there are some clues there in terms of the attributes that so-called transformational leaders have that goes beyond what we have restricted to the notion of counteractive influence. A transformational leader has certain charismatic qualities. People attend to such individuals. They have vision. Transformational leaders show individualized consideration, even if they're dealing with large collectivities. And they are intellectually stimulating, by which Burns and those who have tried to adapt his thinking to the organizational and small group context have come up with, and that's intellectual stimulation. And this is not a reactive role, it's a proactive role that one in a position of leadership needs to say, I have an idea about how we can solve this problem, but you have the responsibility of telling me what's wrong with it. And there's some people who do that well. One is guided by the desire to maximize gain and minimize cost. The servant leader is a person who's willing to make altruistic concessions to the process. And so, I am not here to get my views endorsed. I am here to help people in any way I can discover what are the appropriate responses. That's an activist kind of posture, not a reactive posture. Another body of work in leadership that I think reflects ethical sensitivity has emerged since about 2005, when some people from the business community, like Robert Greenleaf, by the way, who was with AT&T for 30 years in an executive position, and felt that a lot of people in corporate life do a lousy job when it comes to how they view subordinates, which is largely as interchangeable pieces in a mechanical kind of structure where if she's not doing her job, I pluck her out and put someone else in until that person fails. In my estimation, well, that's not a very good way to treat people or to bring out the best in them in terms of making contributions to decision-making and problem-solving efforts. But back to authentic leadership, a couple of people like Robert Greenleaf, namely Bill George and Robert Carey, who were in executive positions in corporate life, have introduced the concept of authentic leadership. Their view was, in light of some of the scandals that took place at the end of the 20th century, of the first several years of the 21st century, and still are going on. If we look at the Great Recession as a consequence of what some people have done in terms of almost betrayal of the public trust. Wall Street bankers are a classic example here. And what was happening with some of those Wall Street banking executives? Well, they were getting bonuses out of your tax money. Other people were losing their jobs. Well, it was that kind of thing that upset Bill George and Robert Cherry, who wanted the public to know, hey, we're not all like that. And came up as best they could with some conceptions of what an authentic leader is. That's the kind of person that in this society at this point in time, a lot of people are craving. They want individuals in positions of authority and who are exercising influence, who mean what they say and say what they mean. And there is a shortage of that kind of individual. So to the extent that authentic leadership and the social science work that has been stimulated as a result of these practitioners' publications by Fred Lumbois and his associates are showing that there are ways in which you can, again, take an activist kind of posture and try to be authentic and make clear to people when you're exercising influence. It is in the interest of the collective good, not in the interest of individual aggrandizement. And then finally, I think there's some clues in work by one who is becoming one of my favorite authors, Barbara Kellerman. She's a political scientist at Harvard University. She's written a book called Bad Leaders. And she also indicts what she refers to as the leadership industry, these people who, if you fly on a plane, are advertising their wares, become a successful leader in 10 easy lessons, that kind of thing. She takes a dim view of people who utilize positions of authority and responsibility for self-gain. If you're sometimes looking for a good read, I would recommend any of Barbara Kellerman's books, but she puts into perspective some evidence of how you can judge what kind of leadership you're being subjected to, and that's increasingly important. So I think all these developments converge on a single point, that people who are going to take on the task of influencing others to make particular kinds of choices and decisions have requisite responsibilities that go along with that. What happened to Toyota in the last 24 hours?
They were discovered hiding defects in cars. They were discovered. It was discovered that they were hiding defects of cars from the government.
And what else happened to them? They paid a $1.2 billion fine for that bit of chicanery. Where, you know, when this story broke, people were being told that they were crazy and that they were really putting their feet on the accelerator rather than on the brakes, and that's why they were having these problems. Now they've confessed to telling all these lies. That is the kind of leadership we want. I don't think so. Locally, what happened in the propane industry in the last 24 hours? You don't watch the same broadcast as I do. There is a propane supplier in this region of the state, I don't know exactly what community, who is gouging the public by placing prices illegally on the cost of propane that are $4 above the market price. And when you think you're in one of the coldest winters on record, someone would have at least second thoughts about raising the price of propane gas for a lot of people who are hurting, financially and in other ways. Well, that's my pitch for ethical sensitivity as a needed element to advance the theory that we've been working on beyond its present status, and I think there are a lot of opportunities for doing that and a lot of clues that you can provide, or that have been provided by people who are writing about leadership in general and not necessarily in the context of decision-making, problem-solving groups. With that,